break, somehow everything's easy.
No, that's right.
Yeah.
All right, let's get. So I welcome you today for our Friday lunchtime talk. Before introducing our speaker, I wanted to remind you of the events next week. On Tuesday at 12:10, Gail Rogers from the English department is going to be talking about speculations. He was, as I mentioned on Tuesday, a fascinating book about the history of the concept of speculation, both in science and the fact that speculation in the financial world stems from actually speculations about speculations in science. And so it's actually, I really invite you, it's really, I met him, we talked a lot about it. It's a really fascinating project in the history of science, in the history of ideas. And actually, Gail would actually love to talk to historians and philosophers of science. I think this is a great opportunity for us to actually slightly reach out to a community we rarely engage with. So please join us on Tuesday to listen to Gail Rogers' work on speculation. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce my incredible, wonderful, extraordinary, awesome colleague, John Norton, who is a distinguished professor of history and philosophy of science at P. John was serving the chair of HPS, and before I took over the center, he was director of the center for 10 years, I believe. And I have to say, I would be eternally grateful for because he gave me a well-oiled machine, and I didn't have to pick up the pieces and turn it into something else. So I owe him a whole lot. My first 5 years were not a complete disaster. I didn't want to run away, find a plane, go to an island, and just disappear from the face of the world. Thanks to John. So we really thank you. So most of you know John's work, so I don't need to spend too much time. As you know, he's a general philosopher of science, also very important philosopher of physics. He has made many very substantial contributions to the philosophy of physics. If you Google John Norton, the dome argument will pop up, for example, among many others. His work in history of physics is extremely important. Groundbreaking work on Einstein's work and research. In recent years, he has focused more on issues of general philosophy of science, mostly on confirmation and induction. Is very well known for his work on the material theory of induction, one of the main views he said in the philosophy of science. And I think I should just end up my very short introduction by mentioning his recently published book, The Material Theory of Induction, which is published by BSPS Open. So it's freely down, you can download it freely from the BSPS website and the University of Calgary Press as well. If you haven't done it, I highly recommend you do it. It's the first book in this new series. So in many ways, I think it's a great book, but also it's wonderful to support this type of new project. And I think John is working on a new book, but I don't know anything about it.
It's already on the website. It was finished last spring, so you can read it now if you want. I've just been slow.
I don't spend all this time on his website, but then so I went to the website. So John, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for that very kind introduction. I always have mixed feelings about an introduction like that because no talk can then ever possibly live up to it. So I'm sorry you'll be a little disappointed, but I'll do my best. If you'll forgive me, I just want to mention that we have a distinguished visitor in the room here, Giovanni Valente, who's a long-time friend of the center, is passing through. I'm sure he'd be happy to chat with anyone who wants to chat with him. Will you be doing the usual autograph signing afterwards? Is that the plan? And I understand you're willing to waive the fee, and the usual fee will be waived. Okay. Yeah, and Giovanni also has had a hand in the fact that I'm just passing it along. All right, let's talk about this paper. How analogy helped create the new science of thermodynamics. I'm going to try and locate this in a larger project because it belongs to a larger project in stuff that concerns me a great deal. The focus is the following. This guy here, pronounced Sadi Carnot.
Right.
Really?
Yes.
Oh my God! I was practicing in front of the mirror. It's going to slip a little, but I'll do my best. So this guy, in a work of 1824, founded the science of thermodynamics. Now I'm a lover of science, and there are a lot of great moments in science that I write about in my work in history of science. I have heroes. Newton's Principia is for me one of the great moments in the history of science. I work a lot on Einstein's stuff. Einstein's discovery of the special theory of relativity in 1905 is another one of those great moments. The proposal of the light quantum in 1905, another one of those great moments. These are all things I've looked at very closely and concern me a great deal. This particular moment is as important as all the ones that I've mentioned. What Sadi Carnot was able to do was to set up a new science. Right? It wasn't just that he discovered some interesting things. There's a complete new methodology there. And it's an extraordinary thing because it just doesn't fit with anything that you would expect to be coming in the studies of thermal processes at the time. If you look at the way it appears in the textbooks, it just drops out of the sky from nowhere. Suddenly there it is. There's this new science full of these strange methods, which are the things that I will be talking about. Now, my concern is scientific discovery. How does this happen? Things don't just drop out of the sky for no reason at all. And that's what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to try and tell you a story of where the unusual and remarkable things in Carnot's work, where it came from. So I'm going to focus on two things. The first puzzle is something that most of you who know thermodynamics won't think is a puzzle at all. And that is, why did he even think of looking for a very general theory of heat engines? Right? He's got a general theory that covers them all. Why would he even think of doing that? Not an obvious question until you place yourself in the time that Carnot was working, and then it becomes a very pressing question. And then the second puzzle is this. At the core of Carnot's work is a particular notion, the notion of a thermodynamically reversible process. It is, kindly put, a very strange and improbable notion, yet it's the idea that drives all of thermodynamics. So the question is, where does this very strange idea come from? And not to hide the point of it all, I'll give you the answers now, so you know where we're going, and then we'll wind back and have a look at how they come about. So the answer is it comes from this guy. There was another guy, a physicist at the time, working on problems in mechanics, and he laid out templates for the sorts of things that Sadi would do. And who was the guy? It's this guy. How would he know of this work? Well, it's his father. Right? So the work of the father is very clearly, once you compare, it's very clearly the source of much of these ideas. So in particular, we're going to see that Lazars was looking for the most general theory of ordinary machines. That was the big focus. So the idea of looking for a general theory was there in the work of the father. Right? And then this very strange idea of the thermodynamically reversible process is a direct analog of the thing that Lazars himself introduced as the most efficient process, so-called geometrical motion. And we'll see how that comes later on. Okay. So let's go back to the beginning. I'm going to review briefly what's in Sadi's book. Here it is. This is the cover page. Only it had a small print run and disappeared almost completely. No one read it. It was only later rediscovered by Clapeyron in the 1830s, and then Thomson and Clausius really built it up. And here's the man himself at the age of 17. There's something admirable about that photo. It has this kind of, this is not just a 17-year-old. This is the perfect form, the perfect platonic form of a 17-year-old, right? I mean, I don't know. I look at it, I'm sort of amazed how they can do that so perfectly. All right, so what was Carnot's theory? What did it look like? It was a theory of heat engines, things like steam engines, right? And the model that he used was the following: is the steam engine, and it's driven by steam. The steam comes from a boiler, which comes from a fire. So there's a hot place that is providing. Let's see if that's being marked. Yeah, there's a heat source that is making things hot. The heat is being funneled into the machine with steam. Then the steam is expanding a piston, right? There's a caloric flow. He was a caloric theorist, as I'll mention in a moment. There was an engine there. The expanding steam then produced motive power. There was no notion here of conservation of energy, right? Energy is a term that is going to develop in the course of the 19th century. And then essentially there's a heat sink down here. So the caloric is going in, caloric being a conserved fluid. The term caloric is being used most prominently in Lavoisier's Elements of Chemistry, going back a few decades. It is one of Lavoisier's elements. It's a conserved quantity. So the heat passes through the engine, and while it's passing through the engine, as an artifact of its motion, you get motive power out. You can actually do useful things. So it's the motion of caloric that generates the motive power. Notice this is not the way we now think of a heat engine. We now think of a heat engine as taking heat energy and converting it into work. If you think that way, you wouldn't have come up with this model, right? Because the most efficient engine is the one that converts all the heat into work. Whereas an essential component is that you always have a heat sink where you discharge the caloric after it's passed through the machine, right? And so this then gives a model that turns out to be essential. And when the conversion theory comes about later on, and caloric turns out to be a form of energy that's converted into work, the need for this heat sink down here is actually recognized as an essential part of the logic of thermodynamics, and it actually becomes the second law of thermodynamics, right? One version of the second law of thermodynamics says you always have to discharge heat, right? There's no process that can fully convert work into heat. Okay, so it gives you a sense of what of the theoretical structure that Carnot was using. Let's look at the main results. The main results have extraordinary power, right? The first one is that the maximum efficiency of a heat engine is determined solely by the temperature of the heat source and the heat sink. I mean, think about that. You don't need to know anything else, right? If someone has a design for a heat engine and you want to figure out what are the limits of its operation, you just ask, well, where are you getting the heat from? How hot is it? Where's the heat going? How cold is it? That's it, right? And this is an immensely useful thing still to talk about today. People worry that there's so much heat being lost in the exhaust of a car, right? Can't we use that to get work out? Not very much, because it isn't very hot, right? And so it's a very directly applicable result. Okay, so the next thing is that this maximum efficiency is realized by a very particular type of heat engine. This is a heat engine that can be run in reverse. It can go in the forward direction, it can go in the reverse direction. And if you want to know how do I get this most efficient heat engine, you just make sure that all the processes are reversible. That is, they can go in either direction. I'll say more about that because it's the key idea. And that then becomes your handbook for improving the efficiency of a heat engine. And I emphasize here, as Sadi himself does, that no other design feature matters. He's been talking about steam engines, but people had asked, well, there were engines that operate with hot air, or maybe you could use alcohol vapor or sulfur vapor or turpentine. All of these things were being discussed. And at a swoop, he's shown it doesn't matter. You know, it doesn't matter what working fluid you're using. These are the things that matter: the temperature difference and achieving reversibility. Now, how do you get results of this immense power? These are very powerful results. Well, he has a method, and I'll show you the proof method. It's extraordinary, and when you first learn it, it's a real jaw dropper. You think, wow, this is really smart. So here's a reversible engine, right? So reversible means you can run the thing in reverse. So let's just see what happens if we run it in reverse. I'm going to take a copy of it. We run it in reverse. And because everything goes in the same way, but in the opposite direction in time, the amount of heat that's being drawn out of the hot place is exactly the amount that's going back in. The amount of work that's produced is exactly the amount of work that's being absorbed by the heat engine, and so on and so on. And so you get this consumption of all of the motive power, and essentially nothing of much interest really happens. Right? So that's a benign illustration of the sort of moves that he's going to make. A very slight change gives you almost everything I've said. Right? You don't need to change much to get almost everything. You might wonder, is it possible to have another engine that is more efficient? That is, it gets more motive power out of the same amount of caloric. Right? Is that going to be possible? So here's the hypothetical more efficient engine. It gets more work out of the same amount of caloric. And here's the original reversible engine now run in reverse. And if you simply go through all the arguments that I've gone through before, you can see that that some of the motive power is going to be consumed to return the quantity of heat originally drawn back into the heat source, but only some of the motive power will be withdrawn, right? And there'll be some residual motive power left over. And so you'll have a device whose sole effect is to produce a net amount of motive power, surplus motive power, which is perpetual motion. And this is one of the things that was well established around this time. There are no perpetual motion machines. It's a very, very striking result. And if you can, once you see this trick, you can see how all the results follow. All reversible engines are going to have exactly the same efficiency. And any engine that is, well, never mind, I'll stop at that point. Okay, that's the setup. Right, nowadays, we tend to think of this as, well, yeah, I've just gone through chapter 1 of the thermodynamics textbook. It's a little odd because it's being done with caloric, not with the conversion theory. But yeah, this is entirely recognizable as what happens in an ordinary thermodynamics textbook. But the question I want to ask is this first puzzle. Why was he looking for theory like this at all? Why would you look for this sort of thing in the first place? Well, we can read what he says about it. This is a quote from his reflections. He's complaining, I don't want to read this quote, I want to read other ones, but I don't want to read this one. But he's worried about thinking about these systems from a sufficiently general point of view, and he wants to do so independently of any mechanism or any particular agent. It's necessary to establish principles applicable not only to steam engines, but to all imaginable heat engines, whatever method, working substance by which it is operated. All right, so that's the general claim. And nowadays, if you know thermodynamics, you're saying, yeah, well, that's kind of what you do. But put yourself in the place of Sadi Carnot, roughly in the 1820s, and look at a steam engine. This is the Newcomen atmospheric engine, one of the very earliest. It has a lot of bits there, and they're all different. They all do different things. So at the bottom here, there's a furnace. And if you want to get the most efficiently operated engine, you ask yourself, well, how do I make this furnace work well? All right, it's all about fires and flues and things. And here's a boiler. You'd ask, well, a boiler, it's another thing. It's a pot with a vessel. How do I get the most efficiency out of a boiler? Or here's the cylinder in which you get the motive power out. The Newcomen engine was an atmospheric engine, so it actually worked by condensing steam. Is that the most efficient way to do things as opposed to using the pressure of steam? And then you have couplings up here, right? Mechanical couplings, and then you have the bit that's actually doing the work down there, the water pump. So when you have all of these many disparate parts, it really takes an extraordinary vision to say, well, there's going to be just one principle that covers the whole damn lot. All right? It's, can I emphasize for you, this is really not at all an obvious thing. Of course, what we think is obvious is not really what matters at this point. What matters is what did they think at the time? So Sadi was very clear and very kind for a Frenchman, I might add, in repeatedly asserting that the English owned the game. The English industry and English steam engines they were ruling everything, and he was very concerned that the French would catch up, right? So what is the state of the art? Well, the state of the art is this. This is Thomas Treadgold's steam engine. This is published, different versions, 1827, 1838. This is the volume that gets repeatedly described as the authoritative work on steam engines. Notice it's about an investigation of its principles, and it's a very complicated work. There are numerous sections that dissect each part of the operation of the steam engine. Right? And I can go through all the different bits here, but you get the idea. And it works at a very fine-grained level. There's a lot of examination of the physical properties of the different working fluids, water, alcohol, turpentine, vapors of sulfur. What are all of their properties? Which one might work out better? He kind of ends up thinking it's going to be water. Water's probably the best one, but you can't really tell. All the way down to even the pipe that carries the steam from the boiler into the cylinder. You could make the pipe bigger, and that way you minimize pressure drop, but then the steam flows more slowly, so it cools more and you lose heat. Or you could make it smaller, but then you have the reverse effect. That was the state of the art. Right? That's how things looked at the time. And this was the authoritative work. No one was thinking in terms of very general theory. Right? So where does he get the idea from? Well, you already know the answer. It comes from Lazars, his father. Here's the father. And I don't know if anyone here is thinking, as I was thinking when I first came across this, who the hell is this guy? No one's ever heard of him. What's going on? Has anyone ever heard of this guy? I mean, you have.
I've read a little book on the origins of.
Oh, you did? Okay, all right, okay. Okay, so anyway, so I was trying to figure out, well, how can I find out about this guy? Where do I go to get information? You know, you can see the library down where, no, it's down the back there, the Carnegie Library has the older stuff. So I figured there has to be a biography or something somewhere. It'll be in the old dusty section. So of course I checked Wikipedia and there it is. This guy, this isn't just some schmuck. He was a leading political figure all the way through the French Revolution and held lots of very significant positions in the French government. One of his major achievements was essentially the creation of the French Revolutionary Army. He conceived it, he designed it, he supplied it, he figured the whole thing out, how to make it work. So I'm trying to see if I can give you a nugget that'll give you a sense of exactly how prominent this guy was. So here's the nugget that I think does it. In 1879, Carnot appointed somebody to be the general-in-chief of the army in Italy. So the question to you is, who do you think that might have been? It's easy if you're French. It's easy if you're French, but the rest of you are thinking, I'll give you a hint, Corsica. You got it, right? Yeah, this is the guy who appointed Napoleon Bonaparte, right? And of course, Napoleon Bonaparte returns the favor, right? In 1800, Bonaparte appoints Sadi Carnot to be the minister of war, and he eventually becomes a count. He gets elevated. This puzzled me because I thought the French Revolution was about getting rid of counts, but no.
Well, Bonaparte was not exactly. He was revolutionary for like 10 years.
Oh, okay.
You go back.
I have a different educational experience. The schools I grew up with in Australia work with the English tradition, and this will upset you, but he was a bad guy in those histories.
Oh, yes, I cannot agree.
Yeah. So it keeps going. His grandson became president of France towards the end of the 19th century. So it's the same one, same guy. So yeah. So you know, when you see something like this, you wonder, how does someone get it? Managed to write? He wrote huge amounts of stuff, mechanics, calculus, a lot of stuff on fortifications. He was a military guy, and so I like to look at this photo and not photo. I'm sorry. I like to look at this image of him and think there's a kind of a life lesson. And the life lesson is, if you had a night like he had, why the hell are you sitting for a portrait the next day? I mean, what's going to happen surely is 200 years plus later, people are going to say, if you had a night like this guy. All right, so let's move on. So the work in question is this. This is his essay upon machines in general. It was published serially in Philosophical Magazine in 1808 and 1809 in big chunks. This is one of the earlier French translations of the original English that could be. Oh, I see. You're thinking it's the other way around. Yeah, you're probably right. That was probably the original. Yeah. Anyway, so what is it about? Well, he's asking himself the question, how do we maximize the transmission of motive power by machines? What sort of machines does he have in mind? At the time, the term machine had a narrower definition. These were the Archimedean machines. These are the 6 Archimedean machines: a lever, inclined plane, wedge, pulley, winch, and a screw. And of course, you can combine these together in all sorts of different ways to make very elaborate devices. And he's interested in how do you put all these machines together in such a way as to get the maximum motive power passing through them. And then he also generalized. He was interested not only in the Archimedean machines, but he was interested in pneumatic and hydraulic machines. So here's an example of a hydraulic machine. This comes from Agricola's De Re Metallica, rather nice little woodcut there. You've got a pump here that's drawing water up from a mine, and it's being driven by a large flywheel, which has an overshot water channel driving it. And if you look at that, it's a hydraulic machine, but it's also a winch. So you can see how you're combining the machines. And so he's asking himself the question, how do we combine all of these machines in such a way as to get the maximum efficiency? And the language he uses is pretty much a mirror of what Sadi later said. Right? It's all about machines in general. Too little attention has been bestowed in the development of these properties, which are common to machines in general, and which for this reason no more belong to the chords of a machine than to the lever, the vice, or any other machine. So he wants the analysis to be independent of everything. So you can now imagine, if this is the state of the art for the efficiency of machines, Sadi is just doing what you do, right? That's what you look for. The problem's been posed, and his father has given a very nice answer to how this should proceed. We'll look at the answer in a moment. And if you read more in Sadi's writing, you can see, the parallels just in the language they're using is very strong. Okay, let's go into the second puzzle. How did Sadi come to conceive of a thermodynamic reversible process? Well, once again, if you know some thermodynamics, you're saying, well, what's the big deal there? It's just it's a thermodynamic reversible process. No, it isn't. It's a really weird thing. So let me describe what's going on here. The thing to contrast reversible processes with are irreversible processes. So this is an irreversible heating. Now, when I look at that, I think that's a very nice cartoon of an ice block melting on a hot brick. But people tell me they don't see it. Is it just me? No, you see it? Okay, good, thank you. Because I see it. So what's happening here is that the heat is passing from the melting ice to the hot brick, and there's a huge temperature difference. It's the other way around. The heat is going from the hot brick to the melting ice. There's a huge temperature difference, and the key idea is that's bad. To pass heat from very hot to very cold and not get anything out of it is a bad thing. Looking ahead, it can't go in the reverse direction. Clearly, the block is not going to get cold and the brick hotter. What's the right way of doing it? Well, the right way of doing it is to build a heat engine. You'd use that same heat to vaporize something, water or steam, and run a turbine and have a whole cycle and the whole game. Okay. So how do we then arrive at the processes that are going to use the heat most effectively? This is good, this is bad. What's the difference? All right. And Sadi is very clear on this. All right. the key thing, I won't read the whole quote, but the key thing is that there should be no contact between bodies of different temperature. What was wrong with the ice block and the hot brick was that they had hugely different temperatures, and you're passing heat from something very hot to very cold without getting anything out in the middle. There has to be a better way of doing this. And Sadi says, yeah, you just want to make sure that you never have heat passing between bodies of sensibly different temperatures. And this is, here's the expression sensibly different temperatures. So let's have a little look at the detail of how that works. So let's say you want to reversibly heat this cooler blue block from the hotter block here. Well, that's bad. You've got a big temperature difference. So what you have to do is make the temperature difference smaller and smaller. And eventually you have an insensible difference. And then you have the sort of process that he's looking for. This then becomes the reversible process. All right, so why is this a reversible process? Well, let's have a look at how it works. Let's say you want to use heat to do work. And in this case, we're going to use heat to raise the object sitting on this piston. So here's a gas of some sort. Here's a heat source. Here's a weight. We want to raise up the weight, and we'll get work out of that. Well, the way that these processes work is you set up everything in absolute equilibrium. There's perfect equilibrium here. The pressure force of the gas is being matched exactly by the weight of the objects on the piston. It just sits there. Nothing's going to happen. If you want something to happen, what you then do is just pull off one of those little weights. So the pressure is now slightly imbalanced. The weight is not enough to hold down the piston. Right? And so the piston's going to rise. Right? The gas expands. In the process, it does work, but it will cool slightly, standard property of gases. And because it's cooled slightly, very slight difference between the heat source and the gas, a small amount of heat will pass into the gas. And then the cycle will just continue like that. This is actually animated. I think it might start if I did enough buttons. Oh yeah, there we go. Anyway, if you watch it, you'll see it. It does that, but in the interest of time, I won't labor it. Okay, so what's this got to do with reversibility? Well, the key thing is if the process is at equilibrium, it takes the tiniest changes to make the process go in one direction or in another direction. So if you want the process to be an expansion process, you just have to pull off, right, one of those weights, so the piston will rise. If you want it to be a process of compression, you go in the other direction, and then the gas compresses. Now, I haven't indicated the key thing here, and that is these are really strange processes. In order to see why, you just need to add a little bit of data here. When we're looking at very small temperature differences, the systems become essentially linear. So let's say we have a temperature difference of 1. It'll take 1 unit of time, say, for 1 unit of caloric to be passed. But the temperature difference of 1 is too big, so you want to make it smaller, right? So you go down to a temperature difference of 0.1, and it'll now take 10 units of time. Or you'll go to a temperature difference of 0.001, it'll take 1,000 units of time. Or eventually, when you get down to the temperature difference of 0, then the time is infinity. And need I tell you nothing happens? Right? So that's kind of weird. And that is the weirdness of these thermodynamic reversible processes. Right? That's why I've called them elsewhere the impossible process. They have to meet 2 conditions. One condition is that they have to be a set of equilibrium states. At every stage in the process, the system is at equilibrium. The trouble is, if you're at equilibrium, nothing changes. Right? At the same time, something is supposed to be changing. And so if something is supposed to be changing, the process can advance from state to state, but then it's not at equilibrium. Right? And these 2 conditions cannot be jointly satisfied. It's an odd thing to put at the heart of a new theory. I should mention this analysis here, while correct, has been disputed. Professor Valente has written very profound thoughts on the matter. Certainly profound. Not correct, but profound. All right. So what does Sadi say about this? Okay, you ask him. You say, Sadi, you know, there's this funny thing going on here. What do you say? Here are his answers. In reality, the operation cannot proceed exactly as we have assumed. To determine the passage of caloric from one body to another, it is necessary that there should be an excess of temperature in the first, but this excess may be supposed as slight as we please. We can regard it as insensible in theory without thereby destroying the exactness of the arguments. Well, no, you're either in equilibrium or you're not. You're either changing or you're not. I don't see how it works. And had another go at it. Let's go down here. He talks about condensing steam. Doubtlessly, this is not strictly possible, but the slightest difference of temperature will determine the condensation, which is sufficient to establish the justice of our reasoning. It is thus that in the differential calculus, it is sufficient that we can conceive the neglected quantities indefinitely reducible in proportion to the quantities retained in the equations to make certain of the exact result. It's a bit of yeah, exactly. Yeah, it doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? Well, in the case of the differential calculus, when you're forming a derivative, the limit state is a well-defined state, right? It's a velocity. Here, the limit state is no process at all if nothing happens, right? It takes infinite time to be completed. It doesn't matter how long you live, nothing's ever going to happen. All right, so where's he getting this idea from? I hope you see that there's something weird going on here. I should perhaps mention it as a footnote. It all works out in the end. I believe there's a way of understanding reversible processes so you can preserve everything in thermodynamics, but it takes a little bit of philosopher's work, right? And Giovanni and I are both worried about exactly what's the work that you need to do in order to get clear on that. But the question is, where does he get the idea from? And well, you know, the answer comes from his father. So let's have a look at where that comes from. His father, Lazars, worked with an essentially dissipative ontology. This is foreign to us now. We would work that way. So the dissipative ontology is the following. He looked at all of these systems and he modeled them as consisting of very many, he would say infinitely many, but very many would be more prudent, corpuscles that are interacting and colliding. Now, we tend to think of these collisions naturally as being elastic collisions. He said, no, at the most fundamental level, they are inelastic collisions. And he's going to derive the entire setup from the idea of an inelastic collision. So what does an inelastic collision look like? You want to use the big body here to somehow alter the motion of the little body. They come together and, you know, inelastic collisions, they just stop dead at that point. All right, so that's what happens. This is the more general formula. If you get two corpuscles interacting in an inelastic collision, and this is the result for just binary collisions, which he then expands up to the case of very many collisions. And then he analyzes this quantity here, vis viva. I think in French he called it force vitale. In German, it would be lebendige Kraft. Nowadays, we'd call it twice the kinetic energy. Right? And so this is the initial vis viva. This is the final vis viva at the end. And this is simply lost. Right? And it's in this term, you know, that all the dissipation happens. So the goal then is to figure out a way of minimizing all of that lost vis viva that's coming out of these fundamentally inelastic collisions. So at this point, let's take a little break and ask, well, why is he using this dissipative ontology? Well, and I'm pretty sure I know what he would say. How else is he going to make the theory work? Right? If you assume that all the collisions are conserving vis viva, then all machines are efficient. They're all equally efficient, and there's nothing to work on. Right? Now, in 1780 something or other, when he worked on this, in particular, this was the time when the French Academy was posing challenges for an excellent theory of friction that Coulomb wins, not Carnot, Carnot the father, Carnot père. What happens next? Well, it's really a complete scientific dead end. And you can see why it's going to be a scientific dead end. But first, I should mention, I was puzzled because I had never seen references to this work other than in the thermodynamics literature. And I looked all the way through the 19th century literature, he doesn't get mentioned. The work just died completely. There are slighting mentions or mentions in passing, but why is that? Well, I think you can see pretty quickly what's going to take over is the kinetic theory of gases, and a kinetic theory of gases, right? Just can't work with these sorts of collisions. If the air molecules in the room here are colliding inelastically, right? Then very quickly they'll all end up in a big pool on the floor here. They'll lose all of their energy. Now that's not to say that this is the easy way to go, because if you think about it, dissipation in the kinetic theory is actually quite difficult. When I rub my hands together and I'm producing friction, right? What's happening? Well, you have to tell a story about a much larger phase space, and all of the energy that I'm putting into rubbing my hands together is somehow being spread over the very many degrees of freedom of all of these molecules. That's a big operation, right? It's not simple, and all sorts of issues come up that still puzzle us today. All of these sorts of interactions are time reversible. So why do we have this unidirectionality? So this is not straightforward. Now, perhaps I'll mention something at this point. I've mentioned this to some of you privately. I think the historiography of this is rather weak in various ways. And this is one of them. The existing literature never makes this point. And I don't know why. I think they're terribly afraid of being seen to be writing Whig history. But I think this is a level of censorship of what is a really important point, where you want to take the risk, because there is a puzzle. Why did this work disappear? It's well done, right? Or at least the results are well established. The writing's a little bit shaky. Okay. So how is Lazar going to get the most transfer of motion? Well, it's pretty easy. When you have this sort of dissipative ontology, the key thing that you want to do is minimize the big shocks, right? So instead of, well, if I want this body to act on this body, if I get them to hit at very large differences of speed, there'll be a big shock. There'll be a lot of lost this fever. And so the trick is to make all changes by imperceptible degrees. Don't do that, right? It's just an animation. You ready? Do that. You see? You just gently push. So you get rid of all of the big differences of force, differences of velocity. Everything's very smooth and very gentle. And then is the next thing. This is the geometrical movement, the reversible geometrical movement. These are, the exposition here is really quite terrible. And it took a long time to get clear on it. And I could see that he was having trouble at the time because he added this enormous footnote, which he said, well, what I really mean is. But let me give you just an example of what I think is pretty clearly going on here. If you want a machine that transfers motion most efficiently, it might look something like this. This is a winch. And we're going to use a lowered weight here in order to raise a weight over there. And you can see the leverage that you get because of the large diameter of this wheel compared to the cylinder. You can use a light weight here to raise a much heavier weight over there. The raised weight won't go as far as this one falls, but that's the way machines work. Right now, the key thing is that all of these forces are in perfect balance, right? And so it can go forwards or it can go backwards. Right, it can just glide inertially in one direction or in the other direction. And then you're in the state of the most efficient transfer of the motion. So what does it look like if you deviate from that? Well, if you deviate from that, this is the way that he suggested could happen. What happens if instead of just having the weight fall gently, you lift it up a little so that the chain here goes slack and then you drop it? Right, it'll come shooting down, it'll lift this weight up, which will then bounce a bit at the other end. Now that's not a motion you can run in reverse, right? And that for him is the critical thing. It doesn't run in reverse. He characterizes that by saying the motions, the positions occupied are determined solely by the geometry. There's nothing further to do to determine this. Okay. All right, so let's move on. I think now the analogy should be pretty clear, right? Lazar has a strategy for minimizing the loss in ordinary machines. And it is essentially the same strategy that Sadi is using, but just with thermal quantities. All right? And you'll see now that the thing that made Lazars' work a historical dead end is actually the key thing, because he has, by assumption, inherently dissipative processes, inelastic collisions, right? And he's trying to figure out how do you survive efficiently with inelastic collisions. And Sadi has the same problem. Thermal processes are inherently dissipative. So how can you have a theory of efficiency that gives you the best result when you have inherently dissipative processes? So in the end, then, the only real footprint that Lazars' work left on the literature was through his son's work in thermodynamics. It's pretty straightforward here. So, I mean, you can see the analogies. I won't tease them out too far for you because it's kind of obvious. But I will make one point about it, right? And now Lazars' idea was that you go to the limit of none of these, of no shocks, of all perfectly balanced forces. And that's a well-defined limit, right? That just gives you benign inertial motion. You remember the winch, if the forces are perfectly balanced, it can just move inertially, right, without anything happening. But if you take the same limit for Sadi's thermal work, you get no process at all. So why was Sadi happy to proceed? Well, he's just taking the template that his father's provided, and it worked over here. It's surely going to work over here. It's like the calculus. You take these funny limits and you think nothing works, but of course it all works out. And that's what he told us. There is an analogy here to water wheels. This is one of the best known analogies. You'll find this in all the textbooks. I won't labor too much because I think I need to finish up. But the idea is that a water wheel is powered by the fall of water. A heat engine is powered by the fall of caloric from hot to cold. And so there's a nice analogy between them. You could use a water wheel to run a water wheel in reverse, and if it's a perfectly efficient water wheel, everything will be fine. You get the same stuff over there. Now, I'm just mentioning all of this because there's one final point that it's kind of a dangling, undecided question in the history, and that is, was Sadi working really with an analogy, saying, oh, well, your dissipative systems are like my dissipative systems? Or did he think there was something even stronger going on here? Now, Sadi died young, and so we have notes and things to work from. So we find suggestions that Sadi might, at least for a while, have thought he was not inventing a new theory, but applying an old one, his father's theory. All right, so Lazars says we may regard a fluid as an assemblage of an infinity of solid corpuscles detached from each other. And so that's how he would deal with the fall of water. And Sadi says similar things. This is a footnote, I think, and there are other notes elsewhere. But is it possible to conceive the phenomena of heated electricity as due to anything else than some kind of motion of the body, such as they should not be subjected to the general laws of mechanics? So there's this dangling thing here. Maybe it wasn't just an analogy. Maybe he thought he was actually applying the father's theory. He wasn't, right? Because the analogy isn't that close. But if he thought it was, that would be even more interesting. So, conclusion. This is what I promised you. I talk about Sadi Carnot's invention of thermodynamics. Here are the two puzzles. Here are the solutions that I've offered you. You may have enjoyed our short time together, or you may not. If you have, and you would like to read more, you can go to my website and you'll find this paper here. Look for the picture of the Newcomen engine, and you'll find the whole thing written up in great detail in the paper. And here it comes. There we go. Yeah, I was looking for photos to finish with. It turns out that all the way through the 19th century, steam engines had this wonderful thing that they blow up all the time, right? And so when they blew up, all the guys got together and they went out and took photos of themselves. So I'm pretty sure it was not just a one-off thing. I was reading Mark Twain's Life on the Mississippi. He was a riverboat captain, and one of the not a captain, was a navigator. What do they call the guys who would tell you where to go? Anyway, and one of the big issues was always that the boilers were blowing up in these machines, and it was really dangerous because when they blow up, it's not just, oh, fancy that, look at the fireworks. Is you get engulfed in superheated steam, and I can tell you that is really bad, right? Steam produces terrible burns. And I used to work in an oil refinery. You're warned about steam. Watch out. Okay.
Not reversible.
Well said.
Break and
15
then
minutes.
we'll have time for questions.
Nice to meet you. How are you? I've seen you on the web and so on. So.
All right.
Oh, you have a footprint. So.
Yeah.
Quite a bit of work with analogies, but far more basic analogies. This was very, very sophisticated.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I can't read this line of spatial analogies, temporal thought, and thinking about the mind.
Oh.
And being interested in particular, not like you in how things go right and are productive,
Right.
rather in how things go
wrong. Oh dear.
And yet only little special metaphors.
So there's the standard analogy between space and time, right?
Yes.
In my diary, I have that little boxes. Is that the sort of thing that you?
Yes, and that is actually pretty well researched, right? So there's kind of line on one hand and the other, and applying them sometimes.
Which are the two? You said there are two. I know one.
Whether are traveling towards the future or events from the future.
Oh, I see. Okay.
If you're online, please write your name in the Q&A text box, and I'll bring you to the conference where you have a few people.
Okay, let me get.
Yeah, please go ahead. Okay.
Hi.
Hi, thanks. That was fascinating and informative. So I just had a question about the premise about the possibility of perpetual motion machines that Carnot uses to get his argument. So, because it's a premise that sort of comes outside of his framework, right? It's just a general constraint on whatever kinds of machines that he can build. Because I can imagine someone going with the picture that you showed where you connect a more efficient engine with the reversible engine and say, well, look, you've given me a wonderful design for a perpetual motion machine. Let's go out and build it. So why didn't Carnot sort of go through that conclusion?
Well, I mentioned just briefly what the issue was. The quest for a perpetual motion machine had been underway for a long time. The idea that there's some way of combining processes so you get something for nothing, was an idea that everyone wanted to make work. But there'd been so many failed proposals for it that they gave up. Towards the end of the 18th century, the French Académie des Sciences had issued a pronouncement that perpetual motion machines are absolutely impossible, and they refused to review any further proposals for it. Now, I never looked into where that particular proclamation came from, but then Lazars Carnot's piece is a very long piece, and towards the end he has a very long section on perpetual motion machines, and given his prominence in French science, I'm guessing it's probably coming from him. So it's not just the French community having a distaste for perpetual motion machines, it's in the family, right?
Is that?
Yeah, so and that was super fun. And it's nice to be back in the 19th century thinking about thermodynamics. I wanted to ask about this issue that you were saying about the difference between analogy and application. And I wonder if it seems like analogy to us because we don't believe polar fluid exists. But if you really sort of embrace, like, it's a fluid, heat is a fluid that moves, and that's where we get work from, just like a water wheel. then it does seem like an application. So are we being too biggish and thinking this is just an analogy?
I'd prefer to say we're just being careful historically, because if you want to make a claim like that, you have to have evidence. And yeah, I've given you the best evidence that I can mount. There was that claim, which I believe is a footnote in the book, and then we have private notes that were published, I think, by his son later on, which included, just a guy taking notes to himself. Maybe, maybe this, maybe that. So the best I could do is just offer the possibility for it. But yeah, it's kind of comforting to think.
Does it make a difference to us to think about whether it's an application or an analogy? In terms of understanding the history of science, what difference does it make? And is this just sort of, isn't this amazing that we can come up with things that are so helpful and useful, even though they're based on completely wrong ontologies or analogies or applications? Yeah,
good question. I don't know. I will say that cases of clean analogies are certainly out there. The one between gravity and electricity is a major one, right? The Coulomb electrostatics is modeled on gravity, and then when electrostatics gets fancier, then people start thinking about modeling gravity on electrostatics. But whether this is a case of, if I could say, my general default when I see big discoveries in science is that if you zoom in and look at it in a fine-grained way, there are lots of little steps. All right. Now, that's not to say there aren't moments when just suddenly, the figure just does something you don't expect. I mean, I've done a lot of work on Einstein here, and yeah, I can reconstruct a lot of why he would think what he would think, and often it comes in completely unexpected places. But then every now and again, there's just this moment where he just does something, and I hate to say, well, that's what geniuses do, right? I hate to, but you're kind of stuck. Well, what do you think? You've asked a great question. You must have thoughts.
That's fine.
Yeah, thanks for the fascinating history. I was reminded of the distinction between principal theories and constructive theories. So it seems like, was it John Wheel who did like the whole list of all the different materials? Seemed like those guys were trying to come up with a constructive theory of these processes. And Lazars' sort of big innovation was that he tried to come up with a principal theory, so a general theory. But I mean, it's anachronistic, but we should be happy to use that distinction to clarify some of what's going on there.
Yeah. You didn't mention the key thing. The distinction between constructive and principal theories is one that Einstein introduced as part of his work on special relativity. And it was one of the great transitional moments when he was stuck trying to produce a constructive theory of electrodynamic processes in which you look at all the little charges in the fields and how they interact and building up a full picture, and he couldn't get it to work. And so he stepped back and said, can I simply restrict everything that's going on here just by writing down a few principles that I know for sure are going to work? And Jeff Boob likes this one. I'm looking. Yeah, Jeff Boob likes this for interpreting quantum mechanics. Can I? And then the special relativity falls out of that. Yeah, it's an interesting thought. What's the connection's even closer than you've indicated, although I know you know this. Einstein's example of a prior success of a principal theory was thermodynamics, right? The only thing I'm not sure about is how refined the principles were, right? It's the impossibility of a perpetual motion machine that's driving Sadi's work. There's no novel principle in Lazars' work. It's all Newtonian. And if you do just the analysis of inelastic collisions, you get everything that he says.
And that's constructive.
Exactly. Yeah, that is constructive because he's done the analysis for a two-body collision, and then he goes through all the steps of having an n-body collision. Yeah.
So lovely stuff. I'm just interested again in this thing about the analogy versus application. And so on. It made me think of the work that Hofstadter did on analogy, and then currently the student Melanie Mitchell is at Santa Fe, who's written on sort of this issue of what artificial intelligence systems can do with making these sorts of moves. And in some cases, they can do them rather easily by just saying, oh yeah, this is like this is like this. But she said there's certain types of analogies that they just can't do, or just happen to yet, that require a kind of abstraction. And I'm wondering if that might be sort of at this border between application and analogy that we're using it. And here's the way I want to just ask you. We've got these nice pictures of like the water wheel and the ball of water, the winch, right? Nice to use the same examples for this. But there have been a lot of examples of a lot of machines that both of them could use. So it's not one case. One could imagine saying, okay, here's one example, another example. This is like this. And in that case, you might have said, well, this is just another example. But it seemed like the way that you described it at the end, it wasn't just another example. There actually is this difference that required the level of abstraction. And that's what made it. Is that the difference that's going on here? Do you think it's a kind of abstraction at a level that's different from just another application?
So I'm trying to grasp the question. So you have this idea of difficult analogies that difficult but fertile analogies that involve an abstractive step that goes above just multiplying examples. That's certainly the way Einstein saw thermodynamics. I think you're right in saying it's unclear if that's what Sadi thought he was doing, right? Because there is the possibility that, as Heather pointed out, there is the possibility that he might have just thought he was directly applying his father's ideas, right? In which case he might have conceived it as a direct application, just another example. So yeah, no, I mean, I think your question should actually be a statement. It's an interesting remark. There is this, there is this difference between just another example, which is what it might have been, or, oh, here are two domains that are quite distinct, but they are analogous in certain properties that make it possible for us to carry over inferential methods from one to the other. I presented it almost all the way through as the second, because that's the way it reads. When you read the book, that's what you see. But then you read a little more carefully and you start to get clues that maybe, maybe it's not that. I mean, we can guess here. Maybe the order of it was that he thought initially he was just applying his father's ideas, but then as the work continued, he eventually realized that he had something independent and different. And so he didn't present it that way, or maybe it goes the other way around. He hit upon this idea, right? And then said, "Oh, wait a minute, it's not that new. It's just really applying my father's ideas." Could be that, or 100 other cases. Again, as I said to Heather, when you're writing history, you're limited by your sources. I don't have enough sources to know which direction or exactly what was going on there. Interesting thoughts. Thank you.
Shaheen, do you want to join us?
Oh, Shaheen.
Turn your mic on.
Shaheen, great to see you. How's the weather in Colorado?
Hello. Hi, John. It's good to see you too. Well, it's great today. It's sunny. That's pretty much why I moved here. It's good good to see you and to hear everyone. So I just had a quick question. I was wondering if, this aspect of Sadi Carnot's work that, he abstracts away from all the details of the machine and has this very abstract principle. Are you saying, or do you think that this is fundamentally different somehow from other achievements in the history of science, like Archimedes saying, I don't need to do any complicated chemical investigation on this crown. All I have to do is immerse it in water, if it, and see if it floats or goes down or goes up. And that's all really, I reduce all material to their density, or Newton's work on gravity, saying all these different trajectories and different phenomena that you see can all be reduced to the same gravitational force, and you can even abstract away from the shape of the object and just focus on the center of mass, and so on. I think it was Nietzsche who said that Thales was the first scientist because he said everything is made of water. So is it really different from this general tendency of finding unity in diversity that just drives science? Is there something fundamentally different there? Thanks.
Well, at the most superficial level of description, what you said is exactly right, but they do differ in the details. You're actually sketching a theory of scientific creativity there, so I'd be rather more interested to hear what you think. I haven't thought of it in the way that you just described it. Is this just a curiosity on your part, or do you have a theory of creativity in your back pocket you want to pull out and tell us about?
I don't think I do. I was wondering if you did.
Well, you might. I mean, think about it. You just sketched the first steps of one, right?
All right. Thanks for joining us, Shaheen.
Thank you.
Colin.
I'm going to remind John to.
Yeah, John. So don't forget. Sorry. Can you just repeat the question because the audience can't hear what the question?
Oh, did you guys not hear the question?
No, the audience online can't hear.
When it comes from the room.
When it comes from the room.
Oh, okay.
Can you just quickly repeat it?
Do you want me to repeat it now? Or
No. That's
too
right.
late?
Next one.
Okay.
So thanks, John. That was terrific. Question I'm going to ask sort of goes in a number of threads here, but you framed it in terms of the scientific discovery, and you told us a story about where Carnot is getting his ideas from Carnot, and and that's very interesting. But it sort of raises the question: why didn't Dad come up with this? Right? What is it that the son is bringing to the table? Was Dad just too busy appointing Napoleon and getting what is it? And I was intrigued in particular by the hand waving nod to the role of calculus in Sadi's approach. I'm wondering if that's sort of a critical ingredient and how that plays.
Yeah. First a small remark, then a bigger one. The hand wavy.
Repeat the question.
Oh.
That's very boring.
Okay, so I've been asked to repeat the question. Why? So I'll summarize. So why didn't Lazar come up with this? And what about this calculus stuff?
Yeah.
Okay. The second one's easy. The calculus stuff would have been on Sadi's mind if he's paying any attention to his father, because his father, amongst his many writings, has written a book on the calculus.
So that can't explain why father doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, father's actually written the book, and son hasn't. And so I don't know how you answer a question like why didn't, right? I mean, you said correctly, he was rather busy. I mean, he was fighting wars all over the place. He was designing fortifications, writing books on fortifications. He was a buddy of Robespierre, and then they didn't get on very well after a while. And yeah, and not to get on well with Robespierre is sort of not very good. And then Napoleon comes to power, and he's disaffected with the authoritarian tendency in Napoleon's practices, and so he withdraws, and then he comes back in again. I don't know. How do you answer a question like that? I didn't see anything thermal in Lazar's writing about machines. There was no thermal illusions. I mean, this sort of thing, if you think about it, I'm trying to figure out the parallels between them and what the connections might be. If there'd been any mention of something to do with heat, I would have jumped on it and said, oh, wow, there it is. But I just didn't see it anywhere.
I mean, if I may, the answer, I think we want more contrast. If we want a theory of creativity or discovery, we want to know more particular detail about it. So it's doing it different from what ours. So why was he thinking about these heat activities? Why is that more central to him than
Colin's asking, so there has to be a difference between them. Why was Sadi thinking about these machines? the heat engines, whereas Lazar wasn't. Well, we do know what caught Sadi's attention because it fills the early part of his book, and he talks about the rise of industry in England and how steam engines are driving everything, and and there's a real need to understand better how they're used. His goal was really very practical. He wanted, I mean, you can see the way it's set up. How do we get the most motive power out of these machines? And this, I might mention, was a huge problem at the time. These early steam engines were massively inefficient. I think the Newcomen engine was something like 0.5% efficient, right? And James Watt at the time had managed to create an entire business simply on the promise of increasing the efficiency of the engines. I think the sales pitch was, buy one of my engines and you will save more in coal than the cost of the engine, right? And now, but you can look at what was doing, at what James Watt was doing, and it follows exactly the principles that Sadi had laid out. So an atmospheric engine operates by filling a chamber with steam. Then you squirt cold water in, it condenses the steam, and then atmospheric pressure pushes the piston down. And Watt's saying, well, that's crazy. You're cooling down, this hot cylinder, and you have to reheat it with steam. So it's a massive irreversible heating that has to be gotten rid of. And so what Watt then does is to have a separate chamber in which he does whatever condensing has to be done, smaller chamber, so you get much less of that. Now, there was no sense that Watt had any, had the general theory, but you can see that Carnot's thinking would fit exactly, how Watt is improving the earlier atmospheric engines. It's interesting because you think, well, Watt was an engineer, he was a businessman and so on, but he had the best scientific training. He'd been working with Black, who, I can't remember the first name, the guy who invented thermometry, the bomb calorimeter, and so he was working with him. And so he had the best theory that Britain could provide, which is absolutely not a patch on what suddenly, this is what's so extraordinary about Sadi Carnot's stuff. Suddenly, from nowhere, you get this incredibly general theory, right? And it's wow.
Bruce.
Yeah, it occurred to me in thinking about Sadi's statement about it sounds like reduction in that one statement that I can't quote now, but
sure.
that indication of thinking about the fluid in terms of the corpuscles.
Right.
And to me, that just sounded like reduction.
Yeah.
That his insight maybe was that I can reduce this, that I've got this higher level of thermodynamic context that maybe is reducible to what my father was doing. So that's one possibility to see it as a proposal of reducibility and reduction.
Yep.
And
yeah. So for those listening in, the suggestion was that Sadi's proposal that all of the thermal processes are just the processes of corpuscles doing things is a proposal for a reduction relation as we would now understand it. Yeah, I think that's right, but you've got to remember that's the way everyone operated in the shadow of Newton. Everything was corpuscles interacting with everything else. Right? The field movement hadn't taken over yet. Faraday is still winding up and hasn't gotten very far with his, with this field conception. So yeah, those sorts of reductions were just part of the course. Yeah, no, I think you're right. Yeah, well, it wasn't. I think this rampant corpuscularianism was not terribly fruitful. Here I like Alan Chalmers' book on the kinetic theory of heat, or rather on atomism. He says really the theory didn't get decent scientific credentials until at least the mid-19th century. And up until then, it was just this happy speculation of just the type that you saw. There's rampant everywhere, everyone's speculating, but it's very hard to see that it's evidentially well-grounded. I mean, Newton in particular, the impact of, remember Newton's Newton's still a kind of a memory at this time. He's died in the early 18th century, but he's left behind his queries to the optics, which is an entire program for doing matter theory. It's all on corpuscles interacting, and that had a profound influence on what happened over the next 100 years.
Oh yeah, thanks. I was just curious about what the uptake of the theory in the engineering was. Because you were saying that these were like really big challenges and they wanted to get more efficient. So I imagine that this theory would be very welcome, but you mentioned that it was kind of it died and it took several decades before it was taken up again. So I'm curious why that was.
It never lived. All right. It fell stillborn from the presses. Sadi died within a few years. I don't remember exactly. I mean, this is the standard history. I've never gone into the details of it, but the standard history is that Perpetual comes across this work and then reproduces the results and draws everyone's attention to it sometime in the 1830s. Still not much happens until about 1850, where you've got Thomson and Clausius. Those are the two big figures. They recognize that something really important has happened in Carnot's work, and it's from that moment on that Carnot's methods become central to the theories of steam engines and the general thermodynamics. Thomson coins the expression thermodynamics in a footnote somewhere. I can't remember exactly. He uses Carnot's argumentation in, I think it's 1848, to produce the thermodynamic temperature scale. If you've been following the history of temperature, exactly, which is the right temperature, a mercury thermometer, an alcohol thermometer, or what? What's the true temperature? Carnot's work enables you to define a thing known as the thermodynamic temperature scale, and Thomson uses the methods of Carnot to introduce this absolute temperature scale while still being a caloric theorist. Right. Eventually, Joule gets onto him and turns him into someone who sees that heat and work are interconvertible. Right. And Clausius has the same idea. But it's 1850 plus or minus for a few years. That's when it all happens.
Google engrams for Carnot. It's kind of interesting.
Oh wow.
That's for Lazar.
That's for Lazar. Yeah. I'd like to see it for Sadi. That would be. It ought to have a huge spike around 1850.
So part of me wants to find out how prevalent were steam engines in France in 1805. Like what was it? Lazar not right wing this because he was building armies and doing approach the air, and because steam engines were mostly in England. And
do you recall?
Like the new thing, and it was what the kids were playing around with, and so Sadie picks it up anyway. But that's probably beyond.
I just don't know. It's a great question, but the picture that Sadi paints in the introduction is of French industry languishing. The fact that it had been through a revolution and all these wars is not going to help, right? It's not exactly the best time to build up new industry.
If you get back to the thing that you asked me about application analysis, I have thoughts, and I wanted to say what about you. And that was that it might be this really interesting thing about applied science. It starts as an application, but becomes an analogy as divergences with the original setup appear to the author. And that's how applied science is theoretically, one of the ways that applied science is really theoretically useful and interesting. And so maybe that's what happens in these kinds of cases, is this sort of application becomes an analogy because you notice it's not quite an application anymore. You have to work with it to make it work, and then it becomes an analogy.
I'll just repeat it for the millions who are watching. The suggestion is that this type of analogical work might start out as an application, but then perhaps if I could say it takes on a life of its own and becomes, I think you can fit that to the history. Sadi starts out telling us he's going to solve all these practical problems, but by the time you get to the end of the book, he's just giving you the physics of ideal gases. He's using his thermodynamic methods to understand the physics of ideal gases, and of course that's the way it develops. If you do any any biochemistry, right? The principles that are laid out in the thermodynamics by the time it's developed in the 1850s are the same principles that are governing chemical reactions in the cell, right? They are all, we like to think of free energy as the driving force here, but free energy in the context of cellular reactions is just a surrogate for entropy. These are entropically favored chemical reactions. So yeah, I mean, who would have thought steam engines and trying to figure out how ribosomes work? It would be the same. It would be the same theory, right?
All right, and on this thoughts, we're going to stop here for today. Thanks, John.
Studied this Lazars. So Lazars getting some notice that some